One eviction notice is filed every 6 minutes in America, but for the man ordered to deliver them, a single knock on a door would force an impossible choice between his duty and his soul. This is the true story of a maintenance worker, a woman in a wheelchair, and the photograph on her wall that brought his entire world to a devastating halt. Leo Mercer was that man, a single father and maintenance worker just trying to keep a roof over his own daughter's head. But when his boss handed him a stack of eviction notices, Leo was thrust into the heart of a system that destroys lives with a signature. He had a job to do, until the face of one tenant forced him to ask, "What do you do when following orders means destroying someone who's already lost everything?" Every morning at 6 a.m., Leo Mercer began his rounds at the Oakwood Apartments, a sprawling complex of 200 units where he'd worked maintenance for 5 years. The work was honest, fixing leaks, replacing light bulbs, unclogging the drains of strangers. It paid just enough to cover rent on his own modest apartment and keep his 8-year-old daughter, Chloe, in sneakers that fit. His life was a careful equation of overtime hours and grocery budgets, a stability hard won after his wife, Elena, passed away from cancer 4 years prior. Chloe was his entire world, and the fear of losing their home was a ghost that lived in the back of his mind, a quiet tremor in his hands whenever the rent was due. The Oakwood was owned by a faceless investment group out of Delaware, but managed on the ground by a company called Summit Properties. Leo's direct boss was a man named Gary Ridley, a former drill sergeant whose philosophy was simple. The property was a machine, tenants were temporary components, and sentiment was a grease that gummed up the works. Summit had recently been acquired by a larger conglomerate, and the new corporate mandate was portfolio optimization. In practice, this meant renovating units and raising rents, or removing tenants who couldn't pay the new rates. The legal mechanism for removal was the eviction notice. Leo first learned his job description was expanding on a Tuesday morning in late October. Gary called him into the cluttered office at the back of the maintenance building. "We're streamlining Mercer," Gary said, not looking up from his computer. "The process servers are backed up. From now on, the final notices get delivered by us. Maintenance sees everyone anyway. It's efficient." He slid a thin stack of envelopes across the desk. Each was marked with a unit number and the words "Notice to Pay or Quit" in stark black letters. "Just slide it under the door. Don't get into conversations. You're a messenger, not a social worker." Leo stared at the envelopes. He knew what was inside: a formal declaration that a person had typically 3 to 5 days to pay every penny they owed or vacate the premises. Failure to comply meant the landlord would file an official eviction lawsuit with the courts. A win for the landlord was almost guaranteed. In cities like Phoenix, eviction filings had become an industrial process, with over 86,000 actions in a single year, one every 6 minutes. Once filed, that record would follow a tenant for years. A scarlet letter that made finding new housing nearly impossible, torpedoed credit, and could cost them their job. This wasn't just a notice. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that ended in homelessness. "Gary, I fix toilets. I don't do this," Leo said, his voice tight. "You do now," Gary replied, finally looking at him. His expression was neutral, bureaucratic. "Or you can clock out and we'll find someone who will, your choice." The unspoken truth hung between them. Jobs that offered health insurance and didn't require a college degree weren't growing on trees. Leo thought of Chloe's asthma medication, the cost of her after-school care. He picked up the envelopes. The paper felt heavier than it should. The first 3 deliveries were numbing. He didn't see the tenants. He just knelt, slid the paper through the gap, listened for the soft whisper of it hitting the floor on the other side, and walked away, his gut churning. He told himself it was just paper. He was just the mailman. But he'd repaired the kitchen sink in Unit 112. He met the young couple living there, had held their newborn while the father found his wallet to tip him. That notice was now on their floor. The 4th notice was for Unit 217. Apartment 217 was different. Leo knew its occupant. Her name was Sarah Bennett, She moved in about 18 months ago. Leo had been called to her apartment his first week on the job to install grab bars in the bathroom and a temporary ramp at the door. Sarah was a wheelchair user, a paraplegic since a car accident 5 years earlier. She was in her late 20s with a quiet intelligence and a stubborn streak. She'd supervised his work with a keen eye, insisting the ramp's angle be just so for her to navigate independently. Over the months, he'd been back a handful of times for minor repairs. They'd shared snippets of conversation. He learned she was a freelance graphic designer, that she'd lost her husband in the same accident that took her ability to walk, that she fought fiercely for her independence. She once joked that her apartment was her fortress of solitude, the one place the world was configured for her. He also knew she'd been late with her rent the past 2 months. The property management software flagged it in red. He'd heard Gary complain about the hassle of her special needs. The new corporate rent hike had pushed her one-bedroom beyond what her disability insurance and freelance income could cover. She was trying. She'd filed paperwork for a reasonable accommodation, asking for a delay in the rent increase due to her circumstances, a right protected under the Fair Housing Act. Summit's legal team had dismissed it. The renovation schedule for her building was set. Her unit was slated for new floors and stainless steel appliances next month, to be re-rented for nearly double. Her time was up. Standing outside the beige door of 217, the envelope in his hand felt like a live wire. This wasn't a stranger. This was Sarah, who had a photo of her late husband, David, on the bookshelf, who grew basil in a small pot on her windowsill, who faced a world not built for her every single day. Delivering this notice wasn't just administrative, it felt like violence. Studies show evictions aren't just a financial crisis. They are a profound psychological trauma, leading to depression, job loss, and a cascading loss of stability. For someone with a disability, the risks were even higher. Finding accessible, affordable housing was a monumental challenge. Losing this apartment could mean a shelter, or worse. Leo's mind raced. He thought of Gary's ultimatum. He thought of Chloe. The system had him cornered. It was designed so that a man like him, a man who needed the paycheck, became the blunt instrument of its force. He was experiencing what ethicists call moral distress, the acute anguish of knowing the right thing to do but being powerless or feeling powerless to do it. His hand trembled as he raised it to knock. Protocol said slide it under the door, but he couldn't do that to Sarah. She deserved to hear it from someone she knew, even if that someone was him. He knocked 3 firm raps. From inside he heard the soft whir of a wheelchair motor approaching. The lock disengaged. The door opened. Sarah Bennett looked up at him, a question in her eyes that quickly faded into wary recognition when she saw his work uniform and the official envelope in his hand. She'd been expecting this. Her shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. "Leo," she said, her voice flat. "Let me guess. Summit sent you." But Leo didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes had drifted past her into the warm light of the living room, to the wall just behind her wheelchair. There, in a simple wooden frame, was a photograph, a wedding photo. A beaming couple, the woman clearly a younger Sarah, standing on her own 2 feet, her head thrown back in laughter. And the man beside her, his arm around her, smiling directly at the camera with a familiar, gentle expression. It was the face of Leo's late wife, Alina. The air left his lungs. The hallway seemed to tilt. The envelope crumpled in his tightening fist. Every thought, every fear about his job, the rent, the system, it all shattered into a million silent, screaming pieces. All that existed was that photograph, and the impossible, heart-stopping truth staring back at him from another woman's past. Time didn't just stop, it rewound. Leo was no longer in the Oakwood hallway. He was in his own living room 4 years ago, looking at an almost identical photograph on his own mantle. His Alina with that same radiant smile, her head tilted in that exact way. But that face, that was David, Sarah's husband. "Leo, are you okay?" Sarah's voice sounded distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. He realized he was gripping the doorframe, his knuckles white. The eviction notice was a crumpled ball of paper in his fist. He couldn't form words. He just pointed a shaky finger past her toward the photograph. His gaze finally snapped back to Sarah's face, searching for what? Recognition. A shared nightmare. Sarah followed his point, then looked back at him, confusion etching deeper lines around her eyes. And then a slow, dawning horror washed over her features. Her breath hitched. You know him," she whispered. "That's my wife," Leo choked out, the words raw and fractured. "Elena, she died 4 years ago." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. Her wheelchair rolled back an inch from the shock. No, that's David, my David. He died 5 years ago in the accident." She stared at Leo, then back at the photo, her mind visibly racing, connecting impossible dots. But how could they look? The answer arrived in Leo's mind with the force of a physical blow. A memory, long compartmentalized because the grief was too vast to examine fully. In the final, brutal days of Elena's illness, they'd had the conversation. She was practical, even in the face of the end. "If anything of me can help someone live, let it," she'd said. She'd been an organ donor. Leo had signed the papers in a haze of tears. After her death, he'd received a formal, anonymized letter from the organ procurement organization. It stated that her heart, her kidneys, and her corneas had been successfully transplanted. He never knew who the recipients were. He never wanted to know. The thought that pieces of her were living on in strangers was both comforting and unbearably painful. But there was another possibility, one far rarer and more intimate. "Sarah," Leo said, his voice trembling, "the accident that took your husband, was he a donor?" Sarah's eyes widened. She gave a single slow nod. "Yes, it was what he wanted. I was told his heart went to a woman in her 30s. His corneas gave sight to 2 people." She paused, the next fact seeming to rise up from a deep, seldom visited place. "And his facial tissue went to a reconstructive surgery for a burn victim. That's what they said." A cold, surreal understanding settled over them. This wasn't a case of 2 identical strangers. This was biology. This was gift and graft. David had donated all he could. Elena had received a rare and complex transplant, a vascularized composite allograft, using donor facial tissue to rebuild her own features after a catastrophic injury Leo never knew about. She had never told him. She must have carried that secret into their marriage, and then to her grave. The face he loved, the face he'd kissed every morning, had partially belonged to another man. A man whose widow was now staring at him from a wheelchair, about to be thrown out of her home. The eviction notice fell from Leo's hand, bouncing once on the threshold before landing face up on the scuffed vinyl floor. The words "notice to pay or quit" were a grotesque joke. "I can't," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I can't do this." He stepped into her apartment, closing the door softly behind him. He needed to sit down. He slumped onto her sofa, burying his face in his hands. The weight of it all, Elena's secret, Sarah's loss, the cruel machinery of the eviction, crashed down on him. Sarah watched him, her own shock giving way to a profound, weary empathy. She maneuvered her wheelchair closer. "You were going to deliver that to me," she stated softly, not as an accusation, but as a simple, awful fact. "It's my job," he said, the justification sounding hollow even to him. "I have a daughter, I need the job." "I know," Sarah said. "I've seen her drawings on your tool cart. Chloe, right?" He looked up, surprised. She managed a faint, sad smile. "You talk about her when you're fixing things. You forget I'm here sometimes. It's sweet." The normalcy of the observation made the situation feel even more bizarre. For the next hour they talked. Not about the photograph first, but about the precipice Sarah was on. She laid out the numbers, her fixed disability income, the freelancing gigs that had dried up, the 30% rent hike Summit had imposed. She showed him the denied reasonable accommodation request. "They say granting it would be an undue financial burden," she said, her voice thick with frustration. "But replacing my accessible tub with a walk-in shower they'll charge double for isn't a burden. It's an investment." Leo listened, and with every detail, the moral distress crystallized into rage. This wasn't an abstraction. This was a woman who used a wheelchair being forced out of one of the few adapted units in the city because a corporate spreadsheet demanded higher returns. The Fair Housing Act was supposed to prevent this, but enforcement was notoriously weak, and the process was slow. Sarah would be homeless long before any complaint was investigated. He told her about Alina, not just the transplant possibility, but about her. Her laugh, her love of terrible mystery novels, the way she could calm Chloe from any tantrum. Sarah listened, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She shared stories of David, his dream of being a woodworker, his terrible puns, the way he'd proposed to her on a hiking trail 3 years before the accident that took his life and her mobility. They were two halves of two different couples, their lives shattered by loss, now inexplicably woven together by the most intimate of medical miracles and the most brutal of economic forces. Leo made a decision. He picked up the crumpled eviction notice, smoothed it out, and tore it in half, then quarters. "You're not getting this," he said. "Not from me." Relief flooded Sarah's face, followed immediately by fear. "Leo, your job. Gary will know you didn't deliver it. They'll just send another one or file the court papers anyway." "Then we'll figure something out before that happens," he said, with a conviction he didn't fully feel. "You have rights, we'll fight it." But the universe of fighting it was a labyrinth of legal aid waiting lists, intimidating paperwork, and court dates, a system designed to exhaust people already on the brink. Leo left Sarah's apartment that day not as a maintenance man delivering a notice, but as a conspirator. He had just committed a fireable offense and possibly opened himself up to liability to protect a woman connected to him by a thread of grief and transplanted tissue. He returned to the maintenance office, his heart pounding. Gary was on the phone but hung up when Leo walked in. "All deliveries made?" he asked, his eyes already on his computer screen. Leo's mouth was dry. "Unit 217 wasn't home," he lied. "I'll try again tomorrow." Gary's eyes flicked up, sharp and assessing. "Slide it under the door." "The door has a tight seal, it wouldn't fit." The lie came easier now. Gary stared at him for a long, silent beat. Leo held his gaze, hoping the sheer enormity of what he was hiding wasn't visible on his face. "Fine," Gary said finally, his tone dismissive. "First thing tomorrow. It needs to be served by end of week for the filing deadline." Leo nodded and escaped to his truck. He sat there for 10 minutes, trembling. He had bought Sarah one day, 24 hours. That night, after tucking Chloe into bed, Leo did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out the box of Alina's things from the top of his closet. Beneath her favorite scarf and a bundle of love letters, he found the folder from the hospital. There, among the clinical forms, was the donor-recipient information sheet. It was vague, protecting privacy, but one line caught his eye. Vascularized composite allograft, VCA, facial transplantation. The date of the transplant surgery was 6 years ago, 2 years before he'd even met Alina. She had been in recovery, both physical and psychological. During those years, she never discussed. The surgery would have been followed by a lifetime of immunosuppressant drugs, which likely complicated her later cancer battle. The pieces of her secret life slammed into place, each one a fresh ache. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "It's Sarah, from 217. I found something." Attached was a scanned image of an old newspaper article from a small-town paper. The headline read, "Local man's tragic death gives life and new face to others." Below was a picture of David Bennett, smiling. The article detailed his wish to be a donor and mentioned, in one line, that his facial tissue donation was directed to a young female trauma victim through a pioneering program at University Hospital. The trail was there. It was real. Alina had been that victim. The next morning, Leo went to work, the torn pieces of the eviction notice burning a hole in his pocket. He avoided Gary, throwing himself into a broken garbage disposal in Unit 105. But just before lunch, his radio crackled. "Mercer, report to the office. Now." Gary's voice was ice. When Leo arrived, Gary was not alone. A stern-looking woman in a suit sat in the guest chair. "Leo, this is Ms. Croft from Summit's Regional Compliance Office," Gary said, his arms crossed. "Mr. Mercer," the woman began, her voice devoid of warmth, "we have a digital log of all notice deliveries. Maintenance staff are required to scan a barcode at the unit door upon service. The system shows you approached Unit 217 yesterday at 10:47 a.m., but there is no delivery confirmation scan. Can you explain that?" The trap was technological, simple, and absolute. Leo's one-day lie was already over. He felt the walls closing in. The scanner must have malfunctioned. "We checked the device log. It functioned perfectly before and after that timestamp," Ms. Croft said. "The tenant, Sarah Bennett, is currently on a list for immediate legal filing due to repeated non-payment. Failure to serve notice properly causes significant delay and financial loss to the company. This is a serious breach of protocol." Gary looked at Leo and there was no sympathy in his eyes, only cold calculation. "You're suspended, Mercer, effective immediately, pending an investigation. Hand over your keys and building fob." The ground fell away. No job meant no income. No income meant his own rent would be late. He and Chloe were now just a few missteps from the same cliff where Sarah stood. The system, he was a cog and didn't just threaten tenants, it consumed anyone who stepped out of line. He was no longer an instrument of pressure, he was its target. As he numbly handed over his keys, Ms. Croft stood. "A process server will deliver the notice to Ms. Bennett this afternoon. The court filing will proceed on schedule. I suggest, for your own future employment prospects, that you have no further contact with the tenant. Any interference could be construed as tortious interference with a business relationship." It was a legal threat, a warning shot. Leo walked out of the Oakwood apartments, unemployed, the future a terrifying blank. He drove not home but to a nearby park. He called Sarah. "They know," he said when she answered, his voice hollow. "They suspended me. A server is coming today. It's happening." Sarah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, steady, resolved. "Then we don't have until the end of the week. We have until today. Leo, I've been on the phone all morning. I found a lawyer, a disability rights attorney. She's willing to see us. Right now." It was a lifeline, thin and fragile, but it was the only one they had. This was no longer just about a delayed eviction notice. It was about a corporation's violation of housing law, the ethics of targeting a disabled tenant, and the astonishing, painful connection between two families that gave them a common enemy. Leo had lost his job. Now, he and Sarah were going to war with the very company that had just fired him. The battle for her home was beginning, and the first casualty was his own security. The office of Miranda Cruz, the disability rights attorney, was a cramped space in a nondescript building downtown, its walls lined with law books and boxes of case files. Miranda herself was a whirlwind in a pantsuit, her eyes sharp behind frameless glasses. She listened to Sarah and Leo's intertwined story without interruption, her expression growing grimmer by the minute. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Okay. From a legal standpoint, we have two fires. Fire one, your eviction, Sarah. Summit's denial of your reasonable accommodation request is, on its face, suspect. The financial burden argument is weak when weighed against their renovation budget. We can file an immediate fair housing complaint and seek an injunction to stop the eviction proceedings. But the court moves slowly, and Summit's process server is likely at your door right now." As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from a neighbor, asterisk, "Some guy in a suit just taped an envelope to your door." The formal service was complete. The clock was now officially ticking toward a court date. "Fire two," Miranda continued, turning to Leo. "Your wrongful termination and the threat of a tortious interference claim. They fired you for not scanning a barcode. That's pretext. The real reason is they suspected you of sympathizing with a disabled tenant, which, if we can prove it, is retaliation and violates public policy. But we need evidence. Emails, memos, anything showing they targeted Sarah because of her disability or you because of your association with her. Leo felt a flicker of hope, but Miranda immediately doused it. Here's the problem. Fighting fire one requires time and money we don't have. An injunction is not guaranteed. Fighting fire two requires a separate lawsuit. Summit has deep pockets and lawyers on retainer. They can drag this out for years. You two don't have years. Sarah could be physically removed in as little as 30 days if they get a swift judgment. Leo, you have maybe a month of savings before you and your daughter are at risk. It was the cold, hard math of the legal system. Being right didn't mean you won. It meant you had a chance if you could survive the process. Miranda made a decision. We go nuclear. We file the fair housing complaint today, and we also file a motion for a temporary restraining order to stop the eviction, citing Summit's failure to accommodate and their pattern of practice. To do that, I need more than just Sarah's case. I need to show this isn't an isolated incident. She opened a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder. You're not the first Oakwood tenant I've heard from, just the first with a maintenance man on the inside. She looked at Leo. You worked there 5 years. Did you see other disabled tenants, elderly tenants, get pushed out before their leases were up, before renovations? Leo's mind raced. He remembered an elderly man in a ground floor unit who had a stroke. His family had asked for a transfer to a unit with a walk-in shower. Instead, they got a rent increase. The man moved to a nursing home. He recalled a single mother with a son who used a wheelchair. She complained about cracked pavement on the path to the parking lot. It was never fixed. She broke a wheel on her son's chair and moved out 2 months later. At the time, he'd seen it as unfortunate. Now he saw it as a pattern. Yes, he said, his voice low, there were others. Good, Miranda said. We'll find them, we'll get affidavits, but we need to move fast. In the meantime, Leo, you cannot pay your rent. The statement shocked him. What, but I have to, Chloe? If you pay your rent to Summit, you are funding the very machine trying to destroy Sarah. More importantly, you are showing them you are not a threat. You need to be a threat. You withhold your rent. You place it in an escrow account and you file a constructive eviction claim against them. They change the terms of your employment illegally, creating a hostile environment that forced you out. It's a gamble, but it's leverage. It ties your case to Sarah's. It makes you a co-plaintiff. The ground was shifting beneath Leo's feet again. Not paying rent went against every instinct of responsibility he had. It felt like stepping off a cliff. Miranda saw his terror. I know it's scary, but the system is a game of chicken. They expect you to fold. We have to make them believe we will crash the car. They left Miranda's office with a list of tasks. Sarah was to document every interaction with Summit, every barrier in her apartment. Leo was to reach out to former tenants and to go home and not pay his rent, which was due in 4 days. The weight was paralyzing. That evening, while Chloe did homework, Leo sat at his kitchen table and called the first name on Miranda's list, Marisol Flores. She had lived at Oakwood with her adult son, Javier, who had cerebral palsy. She answered on the third ring. When Leo explained who he was and why he was calling, there was a long silence. Then, a flood of Spanish, furious and heartbroken, translated by her daughter who took the phone. Yes, they had been forced out. They had requested a ramp for their unit. Summit delayed, then declared the building not suitable for Javier's needs and declined to renew their lease. They now lived in a much smaller, more expensive apartment 20 miles away. Javier had lost his nearby physical therapist. They didn't want us there, the daughter said, her voice cracking. We were a problem. Leo took notes, his hands shaking. He made 3 more calls. Each story was a variation on a theme. A request for accommodation met with delay, obstruction, or a sudden change in lease terms. A deaf tenant had her lease terminated after complaining about broken visual fire alarms. A tenant with PTSD who needed an emotional support animal was hit with massive pet fees and damaged deposits, not in the original lease. The pattern was clear, deliberate, and brutal. While Leo worked the phone, Sarah was at her computer, digging deeper into the past. The newspaper article about David's donation had mentioned the university hospital program. She found an old press release from the hospital, celebrating the success of their pioneering facial transplant program. It didn't name names, but it mentioned the donor family and the recipient forming a unique bond of gratitude. There was a quote from the recipient: "I wake up every day thankful for the incredible gift. It's more than a face, it's a second chance at life." Sarah felt a confusing swirl of emotions: grief for David, a strange, empathetic sorrow for Alina, who had endured a trauma and a transformation she'd kept secret, and a dawning, unsettling thought. She called Leo. "The hospital press release," she said. "It says the donor family and the recipient were in communication. Through the transplant coordinator, they had an anonymous letter exchange." Leo's blood ran cold. "Alina never told me about any letters." "Maybe she didn't want to burden you. Or maybe she wrote to me, to David's family." A new, urgent mystery. If letters existed, they were a tangible link, a record of Alina's secret life and her connection to David. They might also contain information, medical, emotional, that could be relevant in ways they couldn't yet see. Sarah promised to call the hospital's transplant coordinator in the morning. It was a long shot, given privacy laws, but she had to try. The next day brought the first major counterattack from Summit. Leo received a formal letter from their legal department. It was not a termination letter. It was worse. It stated that due to his failure to perform assigned duties and subsequent interference with lawful business operations, Summit was not only terminating his employment, but was also pursuing a claim for damages. They claimed his actions had delayed the necessary renovation and retenanting of Unit 217, causing substantial financial loss. They demanded a settlement of $10,000 to avoid a lawsuit. It was a bullying tactic designed to crush him financially and scare him into silence. The $10,000 might as well have been $10 million. Lee showed the letter to Miranda over the phone. She wasn't surprised. "It's a scare letter. They won't sue you for 10 grand. It costs more than that in legal fees. But it's a message. Back off or we will bury you." But Leo was past backing off. He had read the pain in Marisol Flores's voice. He had seen the fear in Sarah's eyes when they'd met the process server at her door later that day. A different man who had smugly slipped the court summons under her wheelchair after she refused to open the door. The enemy was no longer abstract. It had a face, and it was smirking. That afternoon, the second shoe dropped. Sarah called, her voice trembling with a new kind of fear. "Leo, I just got a call from my disability insurance provider. They said they received an anonymous tip that I was no longer residing at my primary address and that my living situation was in flux. They've opened an investigation into my eligibility. They could suspend my payments." This was the "wait, it gets worse" moment. Summit, or someone connected to them, was playing dirty. Cutting off Sarah's income was a death blow. Without her insurance payments, she couldn't pay any rent to anyone. She would be destitute. It was a clear, vicious strategy to make the eviction case airtight. She would have no money to pay the back rent even if she wanted to. Miranda was livid when they told her, "This is obstruction of justice. This is witness intimidation. We need to get this in front of a judge now." She accelerated her plans, filing the motion for a temporary restraining order and including the new threat to Sarah's benefits as evidence of bad faith and retaliation. The following day, Leo did the hardest thing he'd ever done. He logged into his bank account, saw the autopay setup for his rent, and canceled it. He then transferred the exact amount into a new savings account he labeled escrow. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was now officially in breach of his own lease. He was gambling his and Chloe's home on the word of a lawyer he'd met once. He picked Chloe up from school, her small hand trusting in his. "Daddy, are we okay?" she asked, sensing his tension. He forced a smile. "We're fighters, Bug, just like Mommy was." It was the first time he'd used Alina's memory as a shield, and it felt both powerful and terrible. 2 days later, they all assembled in a sterile county courtroom for the hearing on the temporary restraining order. Summit's lawyer was a polished man in an expensive suit, who argued that Sarah was simply a tenant who couldn't pay her rent, that accommodations were considered and denied for valid business reasons, and that Leo Mercer was a disgruntled employee making wild accusations. He presented the unscanned barcode log as evidence of Leo's incompetence. Miranda fought back. She presented Sarah's denied accommodation request. She presented affidavits from Marisol Flores and 2 other former tenants outlining the pattern of discrimination. And then she played her ace. She called Leo to the stand. Under oath, Leo recounted the meeting with Gary and Ms. Croft. He described Gary's dismissive comments about Sarah's special needs. He detailed the technological trap of the barcode system. And then, with the judge leaning forward, Leo said, "Your Honor, I couldn't deliver that notice because I knew it was wrong, but my reason became personal. The tenant, Sarah Bennett, is connected to my late wife through an organ and tissue donation. My wife's face carries the tissue of Sarah's late husband. Serving that eviction would have been like serving it to a part of my own family." The courtroom went utterly silent. The Summit lawyer's mouth opened, then closed. The judge, a weary-looking woman in her 60s, removed her glasses. Counsel approached the bench. A whispered conference ensued. The judge looked from Miranda to the Summit lawyer, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she addressed the room. "The purpose of a TRO is to maintain the status quo and prevent irreparable harm while the merits are argued. I find the plaintiff has demonstrated a likelihood of success on the merits of her fair housing claim and has certainly shown irreparable harm, the loss of accessible housing and the potential cutoff of essential benefits. The temporary restraining order is granted. The eviction proceedings against Sarah Bennett are hereby stayed pending a full hearing on the fair housing complaint." Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her face. Leo felt a wave of dizzying relief. They had won the first battle. But the judge wasn't finished. She fixed her gaze on Summit's lawyer. "Furthermore, the allegation of retaliatory interference with a tenant's disability benefits is extraordinarily serious. I am ordering an immediate discovery period. Summit Properties will provide all communications regarding tenant Bennett and former employee Mercer, and they will cease any and all contact with third-party benefit providers regarding this tenant. Is that understood?" The Summit lawyer nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor." They had won a reprieve. Sarah could stay in her home for now. Leo's testimony had turned the tide, but as they left the courtroom, Miranda pulled them aside, her face grave. "This is a big win, but it's just the beginning. Summit is now backed into a corner. They will come at you harder. They will dig into your lives. Leo, they will look for anything to discredit you. Sarah, they will scrutinize every dime you spend. And the discovery process works both ways. They will demand to see everything about this transplant connection. They will try to use it to paint you as emotionally unstable or your relationship as collusive." The victory felt suddenly fragile. They had stepped onto the legal battlefield and planted their flag, but the enemy was regrouping, and the real war was about to begin. The personal had become painfully public, and every secret was now a potential weapon. The fight for Sarah's home was no longer just about a lease. It was a brutal examination of grief, ethics, and the lengths a corporation would go to protect its profits. And Leo now realized, with a sinking heart, that the face of his beloved wife, a face born of tragedy and generosity, was about to become Exhibit A. The reprieve was a bubble, and it popped within the week. Summit's lawyers, true to Miranda's warning, came not with a sledgehammer, but with a microscope. The discovery requests arrived. Demands for a decade of Sarah's financial records, all of Leo's employment history, and most invasively, a subpoena for the complete medical and correspondence records related to Alina Mercer's transplant and any communication with the Bennett family. Their strategy was transparent: to reframe the narrative. No longer a story about disability discrimination, but one about a conspiracy between a financially desperate tenant and an unhinged, grieving man, using a bizarre medical coincidence to manipulate the court. They wanted to paint Leo's moral choice as emotional instability, and Sarah's fight for her home as opportunistic fraud. Miranda fought the subpoena, arguing patient and donor family privacy, but the judge allowed a narrower version. The hospital's transplant coordinator would be deposed. The connection was now officially part of the case file. The legal battle became a two-front war, defending their claims in court and defending their very sanity and motives against Summit's smear campaign. The pressure took its toll. Leo's savings were dwindling. The escrow account held his rent, but it didn't pay for groceries, Chloe's asthma inhalers, or the looming threat of his own eviction if he ultimately lost his wrongful termination suit. He took night shifts stocking shelves at a warehouse, coming home exhausted as Chloe slept. The shame of his fall from a steady job to precarious gig work was a constant ache. Sarah, while safe in her apartment for now, lived under a microscope. Every package delivered, every takeout meal, was documented by a private investigator Summit had hired, trying to prove she had undisclosed income. Her disability insurance provider, spooked by the legal battle, placed her payments under monthly review, creating a fresh wave of financial anxiety with every new form they demanded she fill out. But in the midst of the siege, the transplant coordinator's deposition brought an unexpected twist. A woman named Dr. Amina Vance testified via video link. She confirmed the basic facts. David Bennett was a donor. Alina Mercer was a recipient of a vascularized composite allograft. Then, under Miranda's questioning, she revealed something new. It is rare but not unheard of for donor families and recipients to correspond through our program, Dr. Vance said. In this specific case, the recipient, Alina Mercer, wrote one letter to the donor family shortly after her surgery. It was forwarded per protocol. And did the donor family reply? Miranda asked. They did. One reply was received and forwarded to Ms. Mercer. Sarah, listening in the conference room, went still. She had never written back. She had been too deep in her own grief. Who had? Miranda secured a court order to unseal the correspondence from the hospital's archives. A week later, they sat in Miranda's office with two sealed envelopes. One contained Alina's letter to the Bennett family. The other contained the reply. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the one from Alina. The handwriting was elegant, purposeful. It thanked the family for their unimaginable gift. It spoke of the agony of her burns, the hopelessness before the surgery, and the profound gratitude for a second chance. I promise to live a life worthy of this gift, Alina wrote. To find joy, to be kind, to love deeply. I will carry your loved one with me in the most literal sense, and I will honor them every day. Tears streamed down both Sarah and Leo's faces. This was the woman Leo loved, speaking from a past he never knew. This was the voice of the face Sarah saw in her wedding photo. Then Sarah opened the reply. The handwriting was different, loopy, youthful. It was not from her. The letter was signed Sophie Bennett, David's younger sister, Sarah's sister-in-law. In the letter, Sophie, who was 16 at the time, wrote about her big brother, how he was her hero, how she missed him every day. She wrote that she was glad a part of him was helping someone live. She ended with a single line, "Please be happy. It's what he would have wanted." Sarah had never seen this letter. Sophie, devastated by the double loss of her brother and Sarah's injury, had withdrawn from the family. They had been estranged for years. This letter, this act of kindness from a grieving teenager, was a forgotten thread. For Summit's lawyers, this was irrelevant sentiment. For Leo and Sarah, it was a seismic shift. The connection wasn't just biological tissue. It was a chain of human kindness. David's donation, Sophie's blessing, Alina's vow, and now Leo's choice to protect Sarah. It framed their fight not as collusion, but as the continuation of a promise. Miranda saw the value immediately. This isn't about manipulating the court, she argued in a new filing. This is about the defendants violating the very principle of human dignity. that this transplant chain represents. The case was now a national story. A disability rights blog picked it up, then a major newspaper. The headline: Eviction Battle Linked by Transplanted Face. The narrative of a faceless corporation trying to evict a disabled woman connected by a medical miracle to the widow of the donor was too powerful to ignore. Public sentiment swung violently in their favor. Summit's social media was flooded. Protesters, including disability rights groups, gathered outside the Oakwood leasing office. The conglomerate that owned Summit began to feel the heat. Bad publicity was one thing. A potential landmark fair housing case setting a precedent for stronger accommodations was another. Their stock price dipped slightly. The calculus of portfolio optimization suddenly included a new variable: reputational cost. They made a settlement offer. It was insulting. Sarah could break her lease with no penalty. Leo would get a modest severance. Both would sign NDAs and drop all claims. Miranda advised them to reject it. They're scared. This is their first offer. We go back with our terms. Their terms were bold. 1. A new, permanently affordable lease for Sarah at Oakwood, with all accessibility features maintained and upgraded. 2. Full back pay and damages for Leo, plus a formal letter clearing his employment record. 3. A substantial financial settlement to be divided between Leo, Sarah, and the establishment of a fund to provide legal aid to other disabled tenants facing discrimination. 4. Summit would implement a third-party audit of their accommodation policies across all properties. They waited. The day before the full fair housing hearing was to begin, Summit's lead counsel called Miranda. The conglomerate had overruled their property management subsidiary. They would accept all terms with one condition: the NDAs remained. No one could speak publicly about the settlement details. It was a victory, but a cloistered one. They had won security, justice, and resources to help others, but the public story would end with a confidential settlement. The systemic poison would be treated, but not exposed. Leo and Sarah debated for hours. The money from the settlement would change their lives. Leo could go back to school, start his own handyman business. Sarah could afford new adaptive equipment, financial breathing room. The legal aid fund would do real good. But silence felt like a betrayal of the other tenants, of the public that had rallied to them. In the end, it was Chloe who helped decide. She had drawn a picture: a big building with a ramp, a sun shining, and two stick figures, one in a wheelchair, one holding a toolbox, standing together. At the bottom, she'd written, "Daddy fixed it." He hadn't just fixed a leak, he had, in her eyes, fixed a broken thing. To take the settlement and vanish would be to tell her that some broken things stay hidden. They made a counteroffer. They would accept the financial terms, the lease, the audit, but they would not sign NDAs. They would, however, agree not to disclose the specific financial amounts. Summit could claim a private resolution. Leo and Sarah could keep telling their story. A tense 48 hours passed. Then agreement: the deal was struck. The morning the documents were signed, Leo walked through the Oakwood gates for the first time in months, not as an employee but as a visitor. He met Sarah at her apartment. They didn't speak. They just sat in the quiet of her living room, the photograph of David and a younger, walking Sarah on the wall, a face that was now part of Leo's history and part of his future. The final surprising detail emerged a month later, as the settlement funds were being dispersed. Sarah, finally reconciling with Sophie over the phone, learned something new. The letter Sophie had written to Alina all those years ago. She had included a small, flat stone from David's favorite hiking trail. A touchstone. Sophie asked if Alina had ever mentioned it. Leo, hearing this, went pale. He rushed home and back to the box of Alina's things. Beneath the letters and hospital papers at the very bottom was a small velvet pouch. Inside was a smooth, gray river stone. He had always assumed it was a keepsake from a trip they'd never taken. Now he knew it was a piece of David's favorite place, passed through a transplant coordinator to his wife, and now to him. A literal touchstone connecting two chains of love and loss. He brought it to Sarah. She held it and wept, feeling the weight of the rock, the weight of the years. It was the final proof that their connection was not mere chance, but a tapestry woven from choices. David's choice to donate, Sophie's choice to write, Alina's choice to live fully, Leo's choice to knock instead of slide, and now, their choice to fight rather than fade away. Leo used his settlement share to get his contractor's license. His new business, Mercer and Daughter Fix-It, specialized in accessibility home modifications. His first client, referred by Sarah, was Marisol Flores, who needed a ramp built for her son Javier at their new apartment. Sarah's graphic design business took off, fueled by her newfound notoriety as a disability rights advocate. She began consulting with architects on universal design principles. The legal aid fund they established, named the David and Alina Fund, helped its first 3 families within 6 months. Leo and Sarah did not become a romantic couple. Their bond was something else deeper than friendship, forged in the crucible of shared trauma and triumph. They were family, chosen family, linked by law, loss, and a stone in a velvet pouch. Chloe called Sarah Aunt Sarah and spent Saturday afternoons learning to draw graphic designs on her computer. The Oakwood apartments underwent the third-party audit. It found widespread violations. Summit Properties was forced to settle a separate, larger class action suit. The corporate parent sold the subsidiary, citing a strategic refocus. The system hadn't been broken, but a crack had been made, and light had gotten in. One evening, Leo stood at his own doorway, watching Chloe and Sarah through the screen door, bent over a drawing at the kitchen table. He thought of the eviction notice he'd crumpled, the face in the photograph, the impossible choice. He had chosen his soul over his duty, and in doing so, he hadn't lost everything. He had rebuilt something different, something stronger. He had fixed more than a leak. He had helped mend the broken logic of a world that saw people as problems. The knock on the door that started it all had been an ending and a beginning. The story of Leo and Sarah is a singular event, a perfect storm of tragedy and grace. But the system that brought them to that doorway is grinding on, unchanged in its essentials. Every 6 minutes, another eviction is filed. Every day, more disabled tenants face the same impossible math of affordability and access. What Leo and Sarah proved is not that the system is fair, but that it can be resisted, that the logic of profit can be disrupted by the more powerful logic of human connection. Their fight was about more than one apartment. It was a challenge to a fundamental question. What is a home worth? Is it merely a revenue stream, an asset to be optimized? Or is it the foundation of a life, the stage for our humanity, the one place where we are supposed to be safe? For people with disabilities, for single parents, for anyone living on the edge, that question isn't philosophical. It's a matter of survival. Leo's choice in that hallway, to see a person instead of a problem, to honor a connection he didn't fully understand, created a chain reaction. It turned a routine eviction into a landmark case. It transformed his grief into a tool for building. It turned Sarah's fortress of solitude into a beacon. This is the real, messy, beautiful antidote to the impersonal cruelty of our time. Not grand gestures, but specific, brave, inconvenient kindnesses. The choice to knock instead of slide. The choice to listen instead of report. The choice to fight alongside instead of walking away. The eviction machine is powerful, but it is not invincible. It relies on our compliance, on our fear, on our belief that we are alone. Leo and Sarah were almost its perfect victims, a man afraid for his daughter's stability, a woman isolated by loss and disability. But they found each other. They found an ally in a lawyer. They found a chorus in a community. They turned their specific pain into a shared purpose. The most subversive thing you can do in a system designed to isolate is to reach out your hand. So the story ends not with an answer, but with an invitation. An invitation to look closer at the everyday injustices we accept as normal, to question the orders we are given, to recognize that the most profound revolutions often begin not in the streets, but in the quiet of a conscience, in the moment before a knock. We are all in some way, both Leo and Sarah, capable of profound courage and in need of profound grace. The next knock on the door might be yours to make, or yours to answer. If you believe stories like this matter, stories that uncover the human truth behind the headlines, then make sure you don't miss the next one. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Until next time.